Somewhere in West Africa right now, a child who has never tasted a chocolate bar is very likely working on the farm that grew the cacao inside it. That is not a rare exception. It is closer to the norm across two countries that together grow the majority of the world's cocoa. Meanwhile, the plant responsible for all of it, cacao, was once so valuable in the ancient Americas that people used its beans as literal money, counterfeited them, and traded them for everything from food
Let
to
us
labor
drink to the gods.
to tribute paid to kings. This is the story of how a bitter Mesoamerican currency became the world's most beloved sweet, and why the shift from currency to commodity created one of the food industry's most persistent and troubling
Small
labor
beans,
problems.
but full of flavor.
Cacao trees
10,
are native
11,
to the tropical
12,
rainforests
13.
of
These are
Central
the
and South
finest
America.
of the harvest.
And the earliest evidence of humans processing cacao dates back roughly 5,300 years to the Mayo Chinchipe culture in what is now Ecuador, where archaeologists have found residue of cacao compounds on ancient pottery. From there, cacao cultivation and use spread northward through Mesoamerica over the following millennia, eventually becoming deeply embedded in Olmec, and later Maya and Aztec civilization. The Maya were cultivating cacao by at least 2,500 years ago, and they treated it as something close to sacred. Maya art and hieroglyphic texts depict cacao being used in religious ceremonies, royal
I
feasts,
have come to meet
and
with
marriage
your
rituals.
emperor.
The Maya prepared cacao primarily as a drink, grinding roasted cacao beans into a paste and mixing it with water, chili peppers, cornmeal, and various spices, producing a frothy, bitter beverage that bore almost no resemblance to the sweet chocolate we know today. This drink was often poured back and forth between vessels from a height specifically to build up a thick foam on top, which was considered the most desirable part of the drink. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to dominance in central Mexico in the 14th and 15th centuries, cacao had become something even more significant than a ceremonial drink. It had become currency. Cacao beans functioned as an actual medium of exchange across the Aztec economy, used to buy goods at markets, pay wages, and settle debts, operating alongside other forms of tribute and trade goods. Historical accounts from the era of Spanish contact describe specific price lists in cacao beans. A single turkey might cost around 100 cacao beans. A rabbit might cost around 30. A tamale might cost a single bean. This was not a symbolic or ceremonial pricing
This
system.
shipment from Ghana checks
It
out.
was a functioning,
Everything matches on my
everyday
screen.
currency that ordinary people used to buy their lunch. Because cacao beans functioned as real money, they attracted real counterfeiters. Historical accounts describe people hollowing out cacao pods and refilling them with mud, wax, or other inedible material, disguised to look like a genuine bean, then attempting to pass the counterfeit currency in markets. Spanish colonial chroniclers documented these counterfeiting schemes as a genuine, recognized problem within Aztec commerce, which tells you just how seriously cacao's monetary value was taken. This was not a fringe curiosity. Fake money made from fake beans was a real enough problem that authorities had to watch for it. Cacao held such value that the Aztec Empire required conquered territories to pay tribute in cacao beans as part of their obligations to the empire, alongside goods like textiles, feathers, and other valuable materials. Historical tribute records list staggering quantities of cacao flowing into the Aztec capital annually from tributary regions, underscoring just how central the crop was to the imperial economy. Not merely as a beverage ingredient, but as a form of wealth the empire actively extracted and redistributed. Because cacao functioned as both currency and a prestige beverage, access to it was sharply stratified by class. Aztec nobility, priests, and successful warriors consumed cacao drinks regularly, and the beverage was strongly associated with elite status, religious ritual, and masculine vigor. According to Spanish accounts written after contact, the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma himself was said to drink enormous quantities of a cacao beverage daily, sometimes flavored with vanilla and other spices, served in golden cups that were used once and then discarded.
Let us drink to the gods.
A detail meant to underscore the almost unimaginable scale of imperial wealth and extravagance. Ordinary commoners, by contrast, had far more limited access to cacao as a drink, even while using cacao beans constantly as everyday currency. An interesting split where the bean was common as money, but the beverage itself remained a luxury largely reserved for the upper classes. When Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, they encountered this cacao economy directly, and initial Spanish reactions to the drink itself were reportedly mixed at best. Several early Spanish chroniclers described the bitter, spiced cacao beverage as strange or even unpleasant to European palates, accustomed to very different flavors. But the Spanish quickly grasped cacao's economic significance, even if they were lukewarm on its taste, and they recognized that a crop functioning as currency across an entire empire represented enormous potential value. Cacao made its way back to Spain over the following decades, and it was in Spain, and more specifically within Spanish colonial and religious institutions, that the crucial transformation happened that would eventually turn cacao into modern chocolate. Spanish colonists and clergy in the Americas began experimenting with the traditional Mesoamerican cacao drink, and rather than pairing it with the chili peppers and savory spices used by the Maya and Aztecs, they began sweetening it heavily with cane sugar, along with adding cinnamon and other ingredients more familiar to European tastes. This sugar-cacao fusion transformed a bitter, spicy ceremonial beverage into something recognizably
from Ghana checks out.
closer to
Everything
the
matches
sweet
on my
drinking
screen.
chocolate that would eventually sweep across European aristocratic society. For roughly a century after its introduction to Spain, chocolate remained a closely guarded, expensive luxury, largely confined to Spanish royal and aristocratic circles, in part because Spain attempted to control and limit knowledge of cacao processing and sourcing to protect its economic advantage. Eventually, however, chocolate spread to other European royal courts through diplomatic marriages and trade, reaching France, Italy, and England by the 1600s, where it followed a now familiar pattern, arriving first as an outrageously expensive novelty reserved for nobility, gradually becoming somewhat more accessible as demand and production scaled up, though it remained a luxury item for the wealthy for a very long time. The transformation of chocolate from an exclusively liquid drink into the solid bars and confections recognizable today did not happen until the Industrial Revolution made new processing technologies possible. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a
these are the
hydraulic
best
press
practices for
capable
our
of
cocoa
extracting
trees.
cocoa butter from roasted, ground
You can see the
cacao
spacing
beans,
we need right
leaving
here.
behind a dry cake that could be pulverized into a fine powder, what we now call cocoa powder. Van Houten also developed a chemical treatment process, later known as Dutching, that reduced cocoa's natural bitterness and made it easier to mix with water. This breakthrough dramatically changed what was possible to manufacture from cacao, separating out cocoa butter as a distinct, reusable ingredient rather than something that simply had to be consumed as part of a thick drink. That separated cocoa butter turned out to be the key ingredient that made solid chocolate bars possible. In 1847, the British chocolate company, Fry & Sons, combined cocoa powder, sugar, and melted cocoa butter in a new ratio that produced a moldable paste that could be pressed into solid bar form and would remain solid at room temperature, producing what is widely credited as the first mass-producible solid-eating chocolate bar in history. From there, chocolate manufacturing accelerated rapidly across Europe. Swiss chocolatiers made several critical refinements over the following decades, including Henri Nestlé's development of powdered milk, which Daniel Peter combined with chocolate to create the first commercially successful milk chocolate in 1875. and Rodolphe Lindt's invention of a process called conching in 1879, which involved mechanically grinding and aerating chocolate for extended periods, dramatically improving its smoothness and mouthfeel. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, chocolate had transformed from an exclusive elite luxury drink into a mass-manufactured, widely affordable confection sold to ordinary consumers across the industrialized world. That explosive growth in demand created an enormous and permanent need for raw cacao at a scale the traditional Mesoamerican growing regions in Central and South America could not realistically meet. European colonial powers responded by transplanting cacao cultivation to their colonies in West and Central Africa during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a region with no prior tradition of cacao cultivation whatsoever, chosen instead because its tropical climate could support the crop and because colonial administrations could extract labor and land from the local population with far fewer constraints than would have been possible elsewhere. This colonial-era transplantation of cacao to West Africa fundamentally reshaped the entire global cocoa supply chain in a way that still defines it today. Over the course of the 20th century, Ivory Coast and Ghana in particular emerged as the world's dominant cocoa-producing nations, and that dominance has only deepened over time. Today, those two countries together produce roughly 60% of the entire global cocoa supply, a staggering concentration of a single crop's global production into two countries that, prior to European colonization, had never grown cacao at all. The overwhelming majority of West African cocoa is grown not on large industrial plantations, but on millions of small family farms, many of them just a few acres in size, run by farmers who often live in significant poverty, despite growing the raw material behind a global industry worth well over $100 billion annually. This poverty is a critical piece of context for understanding the labor problem the industry has struggled with for decades. Because cocoa farming is intensely labor-intensive work, requiring constant maintenance, pest management, and, especially at harvest time, large amounts of manual labor to cut ripe pods from the trees, split them open, and extract the beans inside, all of it typically done with machetes. Beginning in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a series of journalistic investigations and formal research reports began documenting widespread use of child labor on cocoa farms across Ivory Coast and Ghana, including cases involving children working long hours, performing hazardous tasks like wielding machetes to harvest pods, carrying heavy loads, and applying agricultural chemicals without any protective equipment. Some of the most serious findings involved documented cases
This
of child
shipment from Ghana checks out.
where
Everything
children,
matches on my
sometimes from
screen.
neighboring countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, were brought onto cocoa farms and forced to work under conditions that met the definition of forced labor or outright child slavery under international law. These findings triggered significant public outcry and media attention
So
in Europe
these are the best
and North
practices
America,
for our cocoa
precisely
trees.
because the products at the center of the story,
You can see the spacing we
mass-market
need right
chocolate
here.
bars, sold under globally recognized brand names, were sitting on supermarket shelves in wealthy countries with no visible connection whatsoever to the labor conditions behind their raw ingredients. In response to this mounting pressure, the major global chocolate and cocoa companies, along with U.S. lawmakers, negotiated what became known as the Harkin-Engel Protocol in 2001, a voluntary industry agreement in which chocolate companies committed to working toward eliminating the worst forms of child labor from their cocoa supply chains by a series of self-imposed deadlines. That original 2005 deadline came and went without the goal being met. Subsequent extended deadlines, set for 2008 and then 2010, were also missed. Independent research conducted in the years since, including large-scale surveys, funded in part by the United States Department of Labor, has continued to find that child labor including hazardous forms of it, remains widespread on cocoa farms across Ivory Coast and Ghana, even decades after the industry first publicly committed to eliminating it. More recent large-scale research, including a major survey released in the early 2020s covering cocoa-growing households across both countries, estimated that well over 1.5 million children were still engaged in child labor on cocoa farms in Ivory Coast and Ghana combined, a substantial share of it classified as hazardous work under international labor standards. That number represents a modest decline in the rate of hazardous child labor relative to the overall growth in cocoa production over that period, according to some of the same research. But the underlying scale of the problem has remained persistently large in absolute terms, even as total cocoa production and the profits generated from it have grown substantially larger. The root causes researchers consistently point to are structural, rather than simply a matter of individual bad actors. Cocoa farmers across West Africa typically receive only a small fraction of the final retail price of a chocolate bar, with the much larger share of value being captured further up the supply chain by processors, manufacturers, and retailers, concentrated primarily in wealthy consuming countries. Persistent farmer poverty makes it extremely difficult for many families to afford to hire adult labor for the intensely labor-demanding tasks required during harvest season, creating strong economic pressure to rely on the labor of their own children, or, in the most serious documented cases, on trafficked child labor, obtained at minimal cost. Multiple studies and industry reports have concluded that meaningfully addressing child labor in cocoa would require substantially raising the price paid to farmers, alongside expanded investment in schools and community infrastructure in cocoa-growing regions, rather than relying primarily on monitoring and voluntary corporate certification programs alone. In response to continued criticism, the chocolate industry has developed various certification schemes intended to address these problems, including Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance, and various company-specific sustainable sourcing programs, each promising consumers that products bearing their label were produced without the labor abuses associated with conventional cocoa sourcing. These certification programs
these are the
have
best
faced some of the
practices
same
for our
structural
cocoa trees.
criticisms leveled at similar systems
You can
in the
see the
coffee
spacing we
industry,
need right here.
including concerns
So these
that
are the best
certification
practices
premiums
for
paid
our
to
cocoa
farmers
trees.
are often smaller than marketed.
You can see the
That
spacing we need
certification
right
audits
here.
can be inconsistent or difficult to enforce across millions of small, geographically dispersed farms, and that even certified supply chains
This shipment from
have
Ghana
in some
checks out.
documented cases
Everything matches on my
still
screen.
been found to contain cocoa produced with child labor, further back in the sourcing chain than certifiers were able to trace. Some governments have moved toward more binding regulatory approaches, rather than relying solely on voluntary industry commitments. The European Union has advanced deforestation and human rights due diligence regulations that require companies importing cocoa and other commodities to demonstrate their supply chains are free of forced labor and illegal deforestation, placing legal accountability on companies in a way that voluntary protocols like Houten Engel never did. Whether these more binding regulatory approaches will succeed, where 2 decades of voluntary industry commitments have fallen short, remains an open question that researchers and advocacy organizations continue to monitor closely. What began as a sacred bean used to buy tamales and pay imperial tribute in the markets of Tenochtitlan traveled across an ocean, was reinvented with sugar into a European aristocratic luxury, was industrialized into a solid bar, affordable to the masses, and was ultimately transplanted onto millions of small family farms across a continent that had never grown it before. Farms that today produce the overwhelming majority of the world's chocolate under labor conditions. That, for a significant number of children working on them, remain a documented and unresolved human rights problem, more than 2 decades after the industry first promised to fix it. The next time you unwrap a chocolate bar, there is a meaningful chance that somewhere in its raw ingredients is a story stretching back to Aztec currency counterfeiters, and forward to a child in Ivory Coast who has never once tasted what that bean eventually becomes. If this story surprised you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Drop a comment and tell us what everyday ingredient you want us to dig into next.